What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 11 top 30 running back rankings. Already put out my top 30 wide receivers earlier today. Now we're locking in on the running back tier list, and let's just dive right into tier 1 here. As per usual, tier 1 very, very strong at the running back position. Pretty much like your high-end RB1s through your mid-tier RB1s are going to be very, very strong. So we're going to start off here with Bijan Robinson going up against the Broncos. After starting off the season, with some underwhelming performances, people were starting to panic. He has gone on an absolute tear. He has put up 20 plus PPR points in 5 straight weeks. Totally fine just riding the hot hand here. Then my number 2 is going to be Devon Achane, really coming off his first down game with Tua at quarterback. I like the matchup here against the Raiders. They're going to be huge favorites in this one. It's a nice matchup. They've allowed the 6th most points per game to the running back position. And even after, the Week 10 Monday night game, Devon Achane is still averaging 24.3 PPR points per game with Tua starting at quarterback. So I still really like Achane. Still think he's going to be a high-end running back one for as long as Tua is healthy. Then I have Derrick Henry going up against the Steelers. Not a great matchup here, but Henry's just been so dominant. He's the running back 1 in points per game. Continue, to throw him in there as a high-end RB1 play. Then someone who I was very interested in looking at heading into last week, it was Christian McCaffrey. We really didn't know what type of usage he would have. Would they kind of ease him in? Would they just unleash him? And they definitely went more towards the unleashing side. He dominated the opportunities. Didn't necessarily have a monster fantasy day, but, was still fine. He had 13 carries, 7 targets. One thing I will point out, that type of usage, that receiving workload, 20 opportunities, that's obviously going to be playable for him as a mid to high end RB1 play. I don't necessarily think he's fully 100% back to the player, before the injury. On those 13 carries, he was not super efficient, and he was actually negative 34 in rushing yards over expected. So not great. It's a 1-game sample size, not crazy to want him to kind of ease his way back in here. But with that usage, if that's what they're going to give him, he's still going to be up here in that RB1 rest of season discussion. Then I have Joe Mixon going up against the Cowboys, coming off a very, very inefficient day on the ground, but he still just continues to dominate the opportunities. In 6 healthy games, Joe Mixon has at least 24 carries in 5 out of 6 of them. That is insane usage. It's a nice matchup here against the Cowboys. Like him as a mid-tier RB1 play. Then I'm going to go with Alvin Kamara going up against the Browns. He's just been very consistent, 15 plus points in 8 out of 10 games, 12 plus points in 9 out of 10. Super involved as a pass catcher. Didn't have the craziest day in week 10. Was actually a dropped deep touchdown pass away from having a monster performance. Didn't go that way. He had a tough drop. It happens, but still someone who I think is a great, RB1 option. And then Saquon here is going to be my running back 7. It might seem low. Like I said at the top, this tier is just so unbelievably stacked. He started to cool off a little bit just in terms of having some floor performances, but still a great play. He's the running back 4 in points per game. I'm not worried. If you wanted to argue him higher, I get it. Then I have Kenneth Walker coming off the bye, going up against the Niners. It's not the best matchup, but they really haven't been completely locked down going up against opposing running backs. He's the running back 6 in points per game. The receiving production has been there this season. Definitely belongs with the rest of these guys. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Jahmyr Gibbs going up against the Jaguars. He's been fine over the last few weeks, hasn't necessarily had these ceiling games. This just seems like a great spot for both these Lions running backs. The Jaguars are 5th in points per game allowed to the running back position. The Lions are 1st in implied points. I believe they're 13.5 point favorites. So this should be a very run-heavy game script. I think both Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery are going to eat. And we'll see Montgomery in tier 2. But starting off in tier 2, it is going to be Kareem Hunt going up against the Bills. This is a really strong matchup here. I believe the Bills have allowed the 2nd most points per game to the running back position. Kareem Hunt, since firmly taking over as the starter, last 5 weeks, 13 plus PPR points. And most of that had been production on the ground. He was getting force-fed carries. What I think was interesting and a good sign of things to come, at least, until Pacheco comes back, was that in a competitive game script, even a trailing game script against the Broncos, he didn't necessarily dominate, in terms of the carries, didn't have a crazy carry number, but he commanded 10 targets. So even in a not so great game script, or you would think, he still had really nice usage through the air. And I think that's definitely relevant for this game because they are actually underdogs here to the Bills. So if they're going up early, he's going to get a ton of work on the ground. If they're trailing, he's going to be involved as a pass catcher. That is why he is a top 10 running back for me. After Hunt, I'm going to be rolling with Kyren Williams as my running back 11. He has a nice matchup here against the Patriots. They've allowed the 7th most points per game to the running back position. I'm not like full-blown panicking on Kyren Williams. I will say, though, the production has been a little bit underwhelming. The usage has been really strong. The efficiency just hasn't really been there, hasn't smashed in the touchdown department over the last few weeks. And here's my concern with Kyren Williams. We're in this spot now where the efficiency has been rough pretty much all season. Even with the wide receivers back, I think the offensive line has gotten a little bit healthier. It's still not great on the ground. His advanced metrics aren't great. So even if the offensive line isn't bad, right, yards per carry, it's not a perfect stat. He's very low in terms of rushing yards over expected per attempt. I think he's at like negative 0.4, which is rough. And we're in this spot where it's like, are the Rams, is Sean McVay going to continue to force feed him when you do have Blake Corum there who could help take the load off a little bit? So it's kind of a minor concern. I still think he's going to have a very strong workload, but I do think it maybe just barely keeps him out of those, tier 1 options. Then after Kyren, going to go with JT. This is pretty much where he's like settled in on the season. He's the running back 12 in points per game. The Flacco takeover hasn't been great just because he hasn't really come in and raised the ceiling of this offense, but he's coming off a really strong rushing day. Fine option, even in a not great matchup. Then I have David Montgomery, mentioned him with Jahmyr Gibbs. It's a great matchup, 5th most points per game allowed, 13.5 point favorites. Even though Montgomery's had some not so like super high ceiling games as of late, I do think this could be the one where him and Jahmyr Gibbs both just dominate, potentially like 20 plus points for both of them. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Josh Jacobs. Kind of a slower start to the season, wasn't hitting in the touchdown department, but in the last 4, he is averaging 17.4 PPR points per game. Now moving into tier 3, still some really strong running back plays. We're going to start off with Chase Brown. And if this wasn't such a bad matchup, Chase Brown would be way higher. It's just that the Chargers have been so tough against opposing running backs. They were allowing the 2nd fewest points per game to the position. But in week 10, with no Zach Moss, Chase Brown was dominant in terms of the usage. 13 carries, 11 targets. 11 targets. That is an insane number. I think he's going to be pretty game script proof. We saw Khalil Herbert get in for a little bit. I believe he had like a fumble and then pretty much didn't see the field after that. So Chase Brown, the usage should be there. As long as he can keep, close to this opportunity share, he's going to be ranked much higher in the future in more favorable matchups. After Chase Brown, I have Aaron Jones going up against the Titans. He's averaging 15 points per game on only 3 touchdowns. So I do think he's kind of been better than maybe his point per game number. He just hasn't really been hitting in the touchdown department. I still think he's a very strong, like mid-tier, mid to high-end RB2 play. Then I have Breece Hall going up against the Colts. Kind of a similar story here. He's been underwhelming as of late, under 13 PPR points in his last 3. And I don't want to say it's like he's been unlucky, but he's kind of just been unlucky. He has 1 total touchdown in the last 7 games. And you could say like, oh, this isn't a great offense. That's obviously going to hurt him. And that is true. But we've seen running backs on much worse offenses this year still have better touchdown luck than Breece Hall. So I do think he's going to turn it around here. The rushing efficiency has been better, but it is kind of tough because he just has not been hitting as of late. But I do think once he can start getting into the end zone, he could definitely vault back up in there with those like tier 2 options. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be James Cook. This is really just a matchup thing. The Chiefs have just been super tough against opposing running backs, the fewest points per game allowed. So just not a great spot here for James Cook. Now looking at tier 4, going to start off this tier with DeAndre Swift. This was actually his worst fantasy game since week 3. Bears aren't lined up great. They're trending down offensively for sure. They have the 3rd fewest implied points this week. They did just fire Shane Waldron, which as a Bears fan, I'm, feeling good about that. Not sure if it's going to get much better, but don't think it can get much worse here. But for Swift, he's just going to be limited by this offense. So mid-tier RB2, I think is a fair spot. Then I have J.K. Dobbins going up against the Bengals. Not feeling great about the usage we saw last week. He was in a 15 to 10 carry split with Gus Edwards. I was kind of assuming that even though Gus Edwards went down, I kind of thought J.K. Dobbins had pulled away from him, was going to continue dominating the opportunities. That wasn't necessarily the case here. Gus Edwards still had a solid role, and Edwards was like really bad early on in the season. He was struggling, he was super inefficient, was not breaking tackles, And so it made me feel better that Dobbins was just like, going to blow him away rest of season. The problem is, and I'm not saying this is going to last, for weeks now, but Gus Edwards was actually efficient with his opportunities in week 10. So I'm not expecting his usage to just completely fall off. Also, the Bengals defense has actually been pretty decent against opposing running backs, the 9th fewest points per game. So maybe not quite as high in J.K. Dobbins as I thought it would have been. Then I have Ramondre Stevenson going up against the Rams. In his last 3 games, he's getting force-fed. We're looking at 23, 15, 21 opportunities. Then I have Austin Eckler going up against the Eagles here. This is going to be assuming that Brian Robinson does not play. He did not practice last Friday. They have the quick turnaround for Thursday Night Football. So as of right now, would assume he's not playing. If he does play, he's probably in like this back end of tier 4. You're not 100% sure if he's going to be 100%. But assuming B-Rob is out, I think Eckler's an interesting option. It's a bad matchup, the 3rd fewest points per game allowed to the running back position, but his usage should be nice. Week 10 with no B-Rob, 13 attempts, 2 targets, also has gotten to the end zone twice, getting those goal line looks. So definitely a startable spot if B-Rob does miss. Then I have Nick Chubb going up against the Saints. I do think this could be the opportunity for Chubb to have like a breakout, his first strong performance of the 2024 season. This is a good matchup against the Saints. They've allowed the 3rd most points per game to the running back position. The Browns are fine in like their implied point total, 21.5. So I think they're in a decent spot here. This could be a good spot for Nick Chubb to have his best game. Then I have Tony Pollard going up against the Vikings. With Tajay Spears out, Tony Pollard had just been dominating the opportunities. We did see Tajay Spears make his return. The touches were very, very close. I will say, though, Tony Pollard left for a period. I think he missed a couple of drives, which definitely made those numbers look more contested. But I do think his workload is going to be a little bit limited with Tajay Spears coming back. It's not a great matchup here. The Vikings have allowed the 4th fewest points per game to the running back position. So I still think Tony Pollard is in this like fringe running back 2 range, but not as high as I was, just a few days ago before Tajay Spears was back. And then the final guy in this tier is going to be Najee Harris. Now he's dealing with an ankle injury. That's something we'll have to monitor throughout the week. It's not a great matchup here against the Ravens, 7th fewest points per game allowed, but they just continue to force feed Najee Harris. So if he's out there healthy for this one, he's going to be, in this tier 4 area. Now looking at tier 5, I think this is where the running back position starts to get pretty gross. I have 2 tier 5 running backs, and this is pretty much just like 2 lead backs on awful offenses. We have Travis Etienne going up against the Lions. This is not a good matchup. They are bottom 6 in points per game allowed to the position, but I do think this is probably going to be a favorable game script for Etienne. You have Tank Dell dealing with an ankle injury. Etienne's the guy they go to when they're trailing. Well, they're close to 2 touchdown underdogs in this game. So even if the offense is bad, not expecting Trevor Lawrence to play, I do think Etienne could still get some volume and could get some decent involvement in the receiving game. And then the other guy here, Rico Dowdle, actually wasn't bad. Like, he was pretty efficient on his 12 carries, had 3 targets. It's just, once again, like, no Dak at quarterback. Travis Etienne isn't going to have Trevor Lawrence. It just greatly decreases both the floor and ceiling of these offenses. So he might get running back 1 usage, but what's the ceiling really, for that usage? And then the last tier here, kind of like ambiguous backfields or like a strong RB2 spot. We have Jaylen Warren going up against the Ravens. Now, Najee dealing with that ankle, maybe it restricts his workload. If Najee's out, obviously Jaylen Warren would get a big bump. But in the last 3 games, even with Najee healthy, Jaylen Warren has still seen 15, 12, and 16 opportunities. I think this game also has the potential to be a strong game script for Jaylen Warren. If the Ravens go ahead early, that could definitely lead to more Jaylen Warren usage. Then we have Alexander Mattison going up against the Dolphins. He was on a nice stretch with Zamir White out and then kind of out of the rotation. Unfortunately, before the bye, he was kind of in a pretty decent split with Zamir White. Still would view him as the running back 1, but not a super fun play. And then Audric Estime, someone who's interesting. He, clearly led the Broncos in carries, 14 out of the 17 running back carries. He really didn't do a ton with them, didn't get into the end zone, was not involved as a pass catcher. But Sean Payton said he liked what they saw. They want to continue to get him involved. So could be the most valuable running back for the Broncos. Don't know what that upside is for fantasy. Probably not going to be great, but someone who could potentially lead in carries at this point, like running back 30. I think it's a fair spot. That is going to wrap it up for my top 30 running backs. If you guys missed the wide receivers, go check that one out. Thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.